All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 8th, 1987, Gary Hart, former senator from Colorado, former frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for president, gives an interview on Nightline with Ted Koppel, in which he discusses the state of his marriage and his history of infidelity. Now, I said former frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. He was former by just a few months. Earlier that spring, just earlier in 1987, Hart's campaign had suffered a stunning collapse after he was caught with a mistress leaving his DC apartment. Rumors started swirling. The campaign was caught somewhat flat-footed, and we'll get into it, but in many ways the modern political media environment was born. So here to discuss Gary Hart, the personal and the political, tabloid journalism, lots more, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Matt Bai, longtime political journalist with the New York Times, Yahoo, now with the Washington Post, author of a number of books, including All the Truth is Out, The Week Politics Went Tabloid, which is about the collapse of the Hart campaign. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And we should point out that the book was turned into a movie starring Hugh Jackman and also a really amazing ensemble cast. You're just like, oh, that person's in it. It's really wonderful. But the movie's called The Frontrunner, and then Matt has re-released the book under that title, The Frontrunner.
Yes,
so unlike
and I co-wrote the movie, so I'm basically I'm basically this is a whole franchise enterprise.
And unlike Gary Hart, you were able to rebrand successfully, right? So this moment, if people have the timeline, the Hart collapse happens in May or so of 1987. We're talking about a moment, obviously, in September when he goes back on Nightline after, laying low for a little bit. And he says on Nightline to Ted Koppel, he gets very emotional, and he says, yes, I was unfaithful. So, Matt, take us to that moment and tell us why, him actually saying those words out loud is sort of notable in the grand scheme of this story.
Yeah, sure, Jody. I mean, it's actually, it's a really interesting moment and overlooked, even in telling the story of Gary Hart, because he gets out of the campaign in scandal, and then there's this really weird coda period where he dives back in for a short period of time and ends up getting walloped, and it doesn't work at all, and was kind of, at that point, sort of a national joke. But in the getting back in, he has to strategize with his team. How do you do that, right? He's gone to war with the media, essentially. He's refused to answer questions about his personal life. He's become the punchline for all this late night humor. He's still polling really well, though. He's still polling when they drop his name in at the top of the field. And the second guy is Jesse Jackson. And in 1988, 1987 at this point, nobody thinks Jesse Jackson is going to be a serious candidate for the presidency. There's been no serious African-American candidate. So there's a window, right? There's still an open, but how do you get back in? And the thinking is you go and you give a big interview, just as you would probably today, and you discuss these things. And so it's worked out that he'll do this with Ted Koppel on Nightline, which is the biggest news show of the day, runs against Johnny Carson, but has a quite sizable audience of its own. And he negotiates. The reason that you see the two of them in this interview side by side is that Hart refuses to do it on a remote camera. He doesn't want to be a guy sitting at home. He's going to be a peer on the set. That's his condition. And he gets to give an opening statement, essentially, and a closing statement. So this is the terms of the interview.
Wow.
And what you have is this really interesting, it's a great hour of television, and I recently rewatched it myself and preparing to talk to you, is that, you have these two giants of their craft and of American life at this moment, right? Really celebrities at the top of their game, but not just celebrities, quite, substantive, intelligent people. Ted Koppel's probably the finest TV journalist of his generation, in my view. Hart, probably the finest politician who never became president in the 20th century, perhaps, or at least in the second half of the 20th century. And the two of them are sort of both in a place they don't really want to be. It's very uncomfortable terrain. Hart has determined he has to answer certain things about his personal life that no candidate has ever had to answer, and he hates doing it. And he's going to try to draw a line between making the disclosure he needs to make to be viable, but also not crossing both his lines of principle and also setting a new standard for candidates who will come after him, right? He's very conscious of this, not wanting to change the bar for American politics. Koppel has to ask questions that his audience wants to know. They're obviously concerned with ratings. They're concerned with getting at the things their audience wants. But he also is very uncomfortable. These are not questions that he wants to ask. A lot of journalists have weighed in saying these things should not have been asked in the spring. He's in a difficult position as well. So both of them are towing the line. They're doing what they know is an important interview. They respect one another. And both of them are having to ask and answer questions that they really don't want to get into. And so Hart's concession there is to say, yes, I will admit, if you're asking me if I've been faithful to my wife, I have not. It's the first time that question is sort of asked and answered in that context. But I won't talk about specifics. I won't talk about specific women. I won't talk about specific incidents. There I draw the line for me and for everyone else. And even as he says that, and even as Koppel brings himself to ask it, Hart makes clear a couple of different times in the interview that he doesn't think you should have to answer it, and he regrets being put in the position. And you almost wonder, watching, if, as he says it, he wishes he'd done it differently. It takes everything he has in him as someone who values privacy the way he does to come out and say what he thinks needs to be said.
I really shouldn't be stepping over this line. I'm currently stepping over. I mean, it's a tough balance, but I mean, all this is tricky. Yeah.
It's so interesting to think about it in contrast to an interview that takes place 4 years later in, I think, early in 1991 or 1992, when Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton sit down together on 60 Minutes to talk about the affair with Jennifer Flowers that Bill Clinton had. And that's such a different interview. It's entirely about their relationship, and Hillary Clinton is there. Gary Hart's wife is not part of this interview, and he very quickly moves it onto other terrain. Do you have a sense of that contrast? And, was Clinton right to do it the way that he did? It seemed better for his political career in the end, but then it's, 4 or 5 years later and the media landscape looks different too.
Well, that's a great point. And also, nobody's reticent about asking either 4 years later. The interview, the tone of that interview is very different, right? The Jennifer Flowers interview. It's a really interesting, the relationship between Hart and Clinton, how one relates to the other just a few years apart is really interesting and sort of a subject of endless speculation. So I'll give you first the answer that defenders of the media's behavior in 1987 would give you. And those who take some issue with my conclusions on that moment, which is that they would say, the sort of popular interpretation is, well, look, the public works through these things, right? In 1987, it was a big new thing. And yes, maybe Hart got disproportionately banged around for it. And, maybe it wasn't a noble moment, but The public works through it. 4 years later, they looked at Bill Clinton. They said, we've been down this road before. We don't really want to go that way again. We're willing to forgive you. So, you can't say that this changed journalism or politics, because 4 years later, the public looks and shrugs and goes, okay, we'll elect you anyway. I look at it very differently, not surprisingly, which is, look, I've known, put it this way, I've known Gary Hart, obviously, and I've known Bill Clinton and interviewed him several times. What is the difference between the two men, right? They are intellectually both superior intellects, very quick on their feet. They both have very strong worldviews and very similar worldviews. They both have a magnetism that you would expect from a top-level politician. They both were leaders in their party. The real difference between them, near as I can tell, is that Gary Hart has these old world lines in the sand, this sort of sensibility about where the line of personal privacy begins. And he's not going over it. And he actually, more than that, he believes that these qualities of sort of resonance and reservation in a politician, even a guy like Ronald Reagan, who the public knows very little about at that point, that this actually makes you stronger in the public mind, not weaker, that you're not willing to go down these tawdry paths. Clinton, who's a boomer, right, is really sort of, is technically of a different generation, and that makes a difference, those years. Yeah. He'll do or say anything to get the prize. He understands now what's required. He's watched this. There's nothing he won't do. He will drag his wife in front of the camera and make her sit there and endure this. He'll answer questions about his underwear. He'll do, and he'll lie outright. And he proves that again and again. He proves it in that moment, and he proves it again later in the White House, that he will just simply look at you and tell you an untruth if he thinks it's not relevant to what he's doing in a governing context. That is what changes in that moment, is not that the public decides, hey, none of this matters. What changes in that moment is that we create a different set of skills required to succeed at the highest level of politics. And among those skills are a kind of shamelessness and single-mindedness and flexible morality. And when you create an environment that rewards shamelessness and a flexible morality, you will get a different kind of candidate and a different kind of leadership. And I believe that matters.
Okay, so there's so much here. I'm wondering because obviously we have had presidential candidates, presidents themselves, commit infidelity and have all kinds of relationships and extramarital affairs, things of that nature. Was it that Hart simply gets sloppy or gets caught in a way that didn't allow him to sort of backtrack or cover it up? Like, what really was the tipping point that made this come to light in ways that others just were not exposed in that way?
That's a great and complicated question.
You could write a whole book
going on. One of the seminal question you're asking, in a sense, is, did this have to happen, or did it have to happen to Gary Hart? In other words, was he more reckless than other people?
Yeah.
Or did he have the misfortune to walk into a very bad moment? And I think the answer is mostly, if not entirely, that he had the misfortune to walk into a very bad moment for a bunch of reasons, right? I mean, Hart is living by the rules he's lived his whole political career by, right? I mean, he was a devotee of the Kennedys. He served on the church committee, which uncovered all the things that John Kennedy was doing in his private life that journalists knew about and did not report. He's been in Washington now. He's been a leading senator and a presidential candidate, a leading figure in Washington for, more than a decade. He knows all the reporters. They go out for drinks. They go to dinner. They know what he's doing. He's been separated from his wife twice, right? Everybody knows who Gary Hart is and how his marriage has evolved, and nobody's written about it. So he has a certain expectation built from experience going into this moment. But there's a lot swirling around in the culture at that point. I call it in the book a vortex, right? Chief among these things is that you have a new generation of political journalists who were sort of drawn into the process by Watergate, reared in that moment. And they see their principal job as making sure we don't have another dishonest person, a person of faulty character in the White House. Character really matters to them. There's a sense among the political journalism set that there was a massive failure in Watergate, right? Yes, there was this great moment, and Woodward and Bernstein were heroes, but the political media, who should have known Nixon for decades, just seemed to fall down on the job. And here we got this guy who was, psychologically unstable in the presidency, doing a lot of damage. So there was a feeling that had to be prevented again. There's a basic shift in privacy going on in the entire culture, right? The cameras now go everywhere. You're at the birth of satellite news. The news is breaking constantly. So there's a new sort of tabloid quality to the news that's infecting other parts of the society and the media. You also have the birth of punditry, right? You've just seen the launch of the McLaughlin Group. It's just gone syndicated. So CNN is new. The satellite dishes are new. The punditry is new. Suddenly journalists can opine about people's character and give opinions they aren't able to give in their coverage. And all of this is swirling around hard. And he's really the least prepared person you could have for this because his experience is so different. He is such a private person. He does have these very sharp lines that he doesn't want to cross. And so when his advisors tell him, this is a different moment, you can't be reckless, you need to behave differently, he says yes, he gets it. But, interestingly, he almost alludes to this in that interview with Ted Koppel. He comes very close. There's almost a defiant part of him. There's a part of him that thinks, okay, but I'm going to be the person I know I should be. I'm going to have my private life, whether you like it or not. And I think that defiance is what leads him into places he should not have been, prior to his announcement as president.
He's not like a rube or totally like steamrolled by this new world he's found himself in, because he very consciously, I think, tries to draw some lines and take a stand. And I think maybe deludes himself into thinking that if he takes a stand, maybe that'll be the end of this new era and he can actually put his finger in the dam or whatever. But just simply trying to take a stand, I think, indicates at least at some level he understands the world is shifting. And he actually says it in this interview we're talking about in September with Koppel. He says, I'm going to answer this question you just asked me, but I hope it's the last time anyone ever has to, a politician ever has to answer this question again or something like that. And you hear that and you're like,
and
come on, buddy.
And everything went back to normal. You have to know that he knows, right, when he says that. That's not going to happen. But
there's still some like attempt at agency there or something.
Yeah. He's been told. And I think, there are limits to which we can psychoanalyze people, and God, Hart was probably the most psychoanalyzed politician of his era. But I would say, knowing him and having spoken to so many people in that moment, I think there was almost a feeling of suffocation for him. There was a whole school of thought afterward that he didn't really want to be president, because if he really wanted to be president, he wouldn't have behaved that way. And Ted Koppel alludes to this, and he alludes to the primary story that put that theory forward by Gail Sheehy at the time. I don't think that's true. In fact, I'm certain it's not.
Wait, you're saying that Gail Sheehy story wasn't true? Because that's the one where he says he only 50% wants to be president.
Yeah, I'm saying
that's a pretty big tell.
What I'm saying is I think that's the wrong analysis to come away with. Is he doesn't want the job. He desperately wants the job. He wants to serve. But there is, I think, this feeling, as I say, of almost suffocation. Like, I'll have to give up everything, right? He doesn't feel was true of presidents in the past. But it's coming home to him. It's being told to him, and he's understanding, I won't have any privacy. He says to the Secret Service in 1984, and I wrote this into the movie. There's a scene in the movie where this is repeated by J.K. Simmons' character, but it's a true story. He says to the Secret Service in 1984, when he suddenly becomes a big candidate, hey, if I'm president and I want to go back to Colorado and see my kids and shop in a used bookstore in Boulder, do I have to bring the media? And they say, yes, the media has to go everywhere now. And I think it's actually almost a physical sensation for Hart. He can't imagine living that way. It's not what he got into politics for. It wasn't the expectation. It wasn't the way for other presidents that he knew. And so I do think there's that defiance I talk about is an almost physical need for him to draw a line.
Is it also too that it's not that he doesn't just want to relinquish his privacy or time in a bookstore with his kids, but also like with his girlfriends? I think that there's this understood idea that everybody or a lot of people will say are having these extramarital affairs, and it's like they don't have to give up their mistresses. Why should I have to give up mine? Like it also feels a little self-serving in his explanation of that.
I mean, it's a good question, and the truth is, I I don't know what he would have, what his personal life would have done if he were president. I know that he promised his aides, I'm done with all that. But it is important context where Hart's concerned to note that, right, he'd had 2 long separations from his wife. She lived in Colorado. He lived in Washington. They'd been, in love and married in college. So they'd known each other a very long time and had obviously changed over time. They reunited the second time really just before the campaign begins for 1988. So it's not clear what the terms of the marriage were, right? I mean, he never wanted to address that, but it's just not clear that he was cheating on his. It's not clear to me that he was cheating on his wife in the way that sounds, right? In the way that you make that sound. Sneaking around with mistresses. The terms of that marriage were and remain opaque, I think, for the general public, which is fair. But it certainly is relevant in his case, because I don't know that the deception was private so much as public in the eyes of journalists.
There's a fascinating tale to this story too, in the sense that Hart was this effective and talented politician who's brought down by this story. And of course, that leads to more hunting on the media side, but it also teaches a generation of politicians that the way that you end a promising political career is by exposing people's extramarital infidelities. And this is, of course, true in the Bill Clinton case, but I think it's also true in that period around impeachment in the late 1990s, when basically it's exposed that everyone, including everyone on the impeachment committee, is also having these well-known affairs, and they're all exposed in this period, and men as well as women. Yeah. I mean, Helen Chenoweth, who was a congressperson from Idaho, they note that she had an affair as well. And so it really was how people lived, and then it becomes weaponized in this way in the 1990s that does seem directly related to what happened to Hart.
Yeah, I suppose it was inevitable. I mean, it's a really interesting observation that, what journalists learn from this. They learn not only that this is a good way to end a career, but they learn that it's a pretty good way to get noticed and famous, right? They don't get the prizes. Interestingly, there's enough controversy about this in the upper echelons of journalism that the Herald does not get its Pulitzer. The Miami Herald does not get Pulitzer for exposing this story. But they do get famous. Paul Taylor gets famous sort of unwittingly, the Washington Post reporter who asks Hart, have you ever committed adultery? Tom Fiedler, the lead reporter for the Herald, the Miami Herald, and its surveillance of Hart at his home, becomes sort of a regular TV commentator during this period. And so, in this new era of punditry, in this new era of satellite news, the journalist can become celebrities, and this is a pretty good way to do it, and it's also a pretty good way to get prizes, as we've even if it's not in this case. So there's a personal ambition aspect to this for sure.
So as we start to wrap up, I'm curious your thoughts. I'm curious everyone's thoughts actually on the sort of way that a media landscape defines an election. I will say it's notable and interesting that as much as we're discussing this new media ecosystem of punditry and cable and so forth, it is print journalists who are the ones who break this and sort of do the cosplaying as tabloids in the back alley or whatever. But in a larger sense, like, you can look at this story and say, okay, there's this tension here with a changing media landscape and an old school politician who doesn't realize the ground's shifting beneath his feet. But like, that's kind of the story of every election in a way, right? I mean, you can point to any election and say, oh, this is when radio was taking over for print, and this is when TV was taking over for radio, and this is when the internet was taking over for TV, and this is when Twitter was taking over, So like, I just wonder if the most consistent thing is that there's this group of politicians who don't realize that the media landscape has shifted underneath them.
That's a great observation. I think you're right. Virtually every election brings, particularly in our lifetimes or in recent history, brings technological and social changes that people have to get their heads around. And I remember when Howard Dean started raising money off the internet. It was like, you can't raise money off the internet. That's ridiculous. So that wasn't that. I remember Bill Bradley raising money off the internet. So everything changes, for sure. There are shifts in, let's use a geographic metaphor. There are shifts in the tectonic plates, and then there are major collisions, right? There are earthquakes. And I think this was an earthquake because I think not only in this moment, obviously I think that I would have written a book, right? But not only in this moment does character become such a core component of our political calculus where it was not before, but our definition of character changes in a way that, frankly, I don't think we've ever reevaluated or come back from. For most of the life of the country, your character as a politician revolves around your political behavior, and your sins, whatever they may be, are measured in the context of a life and a career. We can pretty much demonstrate that private behavior has very little to do with your ability to govern. But it also, we also create a moment where that one microcosm, that one transgression can overwhelm everything else you've done in a career and in a life. And in fact, will overwhelm everything else you've done in your career and your life, because there's such a motive to overplay it and such little reason to pull back and look with any perspective. So that's a massive shift in the way we cover politicians and campaigns. I think, as I said, I think it had been coming for a while. I think it was inevitable, but it has pretty much been the standard environment for my entire career in covering politics and covering whatever it's been now, 5-6 presidential campaigns. And I think to the detriment of the process and in a way that has disaffected and disappointed voters and made them more cynical.
I think that it's such an important point about it's not just a shift in technology, it's a shift in journalistic practices and political culture. And those happen a little less frequently, and they're such important moments to understand because, again, it's that seismic shift that you're talking about.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that's a great place to end it. Matt Bai, thank you so much for doing this. And I guess one final question. So the book and the movie are called The Frontrunner. How much pressure was there to call this thing monkey business, or did that ever come up?
A lot. I believe it. It's a great question. I mean, a lot. I mean, I never considered calling the book monkey business.
Okay. And monkey business, as people as we should tell people, was the name of the boat on which he began some of his dalliances.
Right. And it would have been, it's funny. I will tell you this story. First of all, the original movie version because there were a couple iterations, would have been called Monkey Business. And to credit Jason Reitman, the director, who said, I said, I really don't want to do that. He said, we're not doing that. I had hoped to call it All the Truth Is Out, like the book, and then I wouldn't have had to reach out of the book, But I'll tell you an interesting story. After the book came out, the former editor of the National Enquirer at that time sent me a nice note telling me he liked the book and defending the actions of the National Enquirer a little bit. And he said, your editors and your publisher did you a grave disservice. If you called that book Monkey Business and put the picture on the cover, you would have sold 1 million copies. And that there, tells you everything you need to know about both that shift in the culture and the National Enquirer. But I wouldn't have done it for 5 million copies because it would have undermined the entire point.
There are still people out there drawing those lines in the sand, as we can see, I guess.
That's right.
All right. Well, Matt Bai, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks. Appreciate it, guys.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I think there may have also been another factor, if I may say so. I had always insisted in the 12 years that I was in public life of my privacy and that of my family. And I don't care what questions are asked tonight or any time in the future. I'm not going to answer them on any specific instance.
Radiotopia.
From